My guest today is Joe Vaughan from Athlete's Journey Home, that has been looking into research about psychedelics and the effect on mental health of athletes. Joe, lovely to have you here. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your path and how you have ended up at Athlete's Journey Home?
Okay, I guess I'll start with some of the sort of personal stuff, which is that I kind of grew up in Scotland, and when I was growing up, one of my friends, his father was a boxer, like a very famous boxer, a guy called Ken Buchanan, who was like a world champion. You know, he fought Roberto Duran in Madison Square Garden, so the top level as a fighter, and he's a very kind of impressive figure in my life. And he had this Jaguar car when Jaguars were kind of cool and sexy, and the number plate was KB123. Ken Buchanan 123 for the amount of times he'd won the world title, and he was like a really popular figure in Scotland, and then he kind of he hit a bit of a decline as he kind of got older. He started to maybe drink more and had issues with kind of alcoholism, and the kind of the remainder of his life was kind of challenging. So that was kind of quite an important kind of imprint on my mind. In terms of kind of athletes and kind of how you can go from kind of the kind of top of the top to kind of almost in the kind of to the lowest of the low. I also kind of was aware of a local footballer who'd committed suicide after his career, and so so I had a couple of kind of things that were kind of imprinted on my mind as a kind of child growing up in Scotland, and then my life has taken me on kind of various kind of twists and turns as life does. Mm-hmm. I studied in Paris. I then got a job in an advertising media agency, which took me kind of around the world, and I've worked in Russia, and so I've kind of had this kind of international kind of perspective on things and kind of built international networks. My interest in psychedelics, entheogens, has been probably kind of maybe nearly 20 years in the making. Mm-hmm. I was aware, started to become aware of the potential for entheogens and psychedelics and kind of helping people. And so I've kind of been kind of trying to marry my kind of professional life, which has been spent in kind of media and advertising agencies, with this kind of parallel interest in psychedelics and kind of an interest in sport. And Athlete's Journey Home was a kind of merging of all three of those things. So building international networks, having a kind of big picture international kind of viewpoint, an interest in sports, and an interest in the potential for psychedelics.
And what do you do now? What does the company that you have founded do now?
So Athlete's Journey Home is a collaboration between myself, a kind of academic researcher, and a professional athlete. Ian McCall, who's the professional athlete, is based in the United States. He's an ex-UFC fighter who had a lot of obviously head trauma throughout his career, so he fixed his head traumas by using a kind of various methods, but including using psychedelics. I also work with one of my other partners, is a guy called Nige Netsband, who works for Onaya Science, and Onaya Science are the team that does the research into the veterans studies, with PTSD, the veterans PTSD studies. So I don't know if you know much about Heroic Hearts, which is an organisation which takes veterans who are suffering with PTSD to Peru to kind of deal with PTSD, and they're doing a kind of a study on the research into that. So Nige is part of that team. So with the three of us kind of have kind of different kind of skill sets and networks. Mm-hmm. So I'm using it to kind of bridge the gap between my professional networks, which has been working on kind of big brands and advertising, and working with media owners, big broadcasters, networks, to kind of bridge the gap between these worlds. And so I guess the kind of the premise that we're kind of looking at is that psychedelics and entheogens have a potentially a part to play in a kind of and to help people who are suffering from either neurological kind of brain trauma injuries or more kind of psychiatric kind of pathways, which is around like things like gambling addiction, alcoholism, substance abuse, eating disorders, and things like that.
So specifically about athletes, we all hear about them when they are big names and they're on every newspaper and every news channel. And then they have very early retirement age and then they disappear from public sphere. What kind of challenges do they face and how can psychedelics help them?
So, I mean, there are if you look at, for example, football at the moment, right? So you take kind of young children from like, maybe sort of 7 or 8 years old, and you put them through this kind of rigorous kind of meat grinder of a process at football academies, and very, very few of them, actually make it through. The ones that do make it through then have this kind of, quite short-lived, they burn very brightly, their stars shine very brightly, and then, at the end of their careers, they're kind of left with, either a successful career where they've kind of won lots of stuff, and then that kind of gets taken away from them, or they have an injury, or they kind of their career kind of fizzles out. And what the immense amount of pressure that that kind of young people, say, for example, in football, have to kind of go through, creates a kind of long-term imprint on their lives. So what we're seeing now is in football, there's a kind of a lot more kind of focus on kind of player welfare. In terms of how to look after people kind of at the end of their career, how do they kind of transition into kind of other areas. So there's a lot more focus on welfare. There's been some high-profile cases around gambling addiction. There's been a lot of kind of high-profile cases around alcohol and substance abuse. Eating disorders are kind of a big issue as well. So kind of bringing it back to psychedelics, how do they help? Well, there's kind of emerging research. I mean, there's the kind of anecdotal research that says, people who've had these kind of issues, go and have an experience and it kind of transforms their lives. So we're looking at kind of the anecdotal evidence around that. So, there's a growing kind of, there's a growing number of athletes who are open about their use of psychedelics. And so, the line is that, the plural of those anecdotes will become data. So what we're looking at kind of creating, kind of a kind of best-in-class, pioneering kind of research framework, which then enables us to, kind of track, athletes going kind of pre-psychedelic experience. So we'll look at, kind of neuroimaging, and we'll look at kind of microbiome samples, and we'll look at lots of different kinds of medical analyses. That's not really kind of my speciality area. So we'll take the kind of the readings, kind of pre the psychedelic experience. Obviously, the key thing to always say with any psychedelic experience is there has to be a process of screening and preparation, because psychedelics are not for everybody. They're very kind of powerful compounds. So you can't say it's a one-size-fits-all. Everybody can do psychedelics because they can't, because there are certain contraindications around pre-existing conditions, pre-medications that people might be on. So there's a kind of there's a three-stage process with psychedelics. You have to screen people properly. They have to be kind of prepared properly, make sure that there's no kind of anything that can complicate matters. Then there's obviously the experience itself, and there's a process of integration. But our process, so we will follow that process. So there's the kind of pre-screening, make sure it's safe, because it has to be safe, has to be done responsibly and safely. Then there's the kind of experience itself, and then there's the integration part afterwards. So, we're going to look at, doing all the kind of, the analyses pre, then we, do the kind of the experience, which could be either with psilocybin or with ayahuasca in Peru, but let's focus maybe on psilocybin because it's a kind of more kind of straightforward exercise. So we're going to look at a psilocybin sort of treatment, and then we track the athlete or the patient afterwards, and make and we kind of build that data set that says, well, this is what's happening.
Is the focus of your work on retirement age, or are you also researching the performance and whether it will have impact on the performance of the athletes?
At the moment, I mean, the interesting thing is if you speak to an athlete who's competing now, they almost don't want to know what's happening, because it could mean if they're a fighter that they can't fight anymore, or they might not be able to play. If they're a rugby player, they might not be able to play. So it's generally going to be people who are more towards the end of their careers or have a specific problem now, because there are some people who have to retire, kind of early because of something like a head injury. But so it's kind of probably people who are kind of getting towards the end of their careers, if we're honest, because some people just don't want to know, what's going on in their heads until later on, which is kind of I guess a bit of a catch-22, because you want to have your successful career on one hand, but at the same time you want to be able to remember it. And we're in a situation now where there are some rugby players who can't actually remember their careers, because of the head injuries that they've sustained during their careers.
Wow.
So things like kind of early onset dementia is a problem. There was a very high profile case of an ex-England player who actually won the World Cup playing for England, who can't actually remember playing in the game. A friend of mine, a guy called Rory Lamont, who used to play for Scotland, had a successful international rugby career. I'm not going to betray any confidences because Rory speaks openly about these things. Is that he was playing professional rugby for, I think it was Glasgow, and he'd been previously playing in France. So he told me that he'd been playing in France and he'd moved to Glasgow. That's where his career had taken him. And he got knocked out playing for Glasgow. And he woke up on the field and he couldn't remember how he'd got to Glasgow in that moment. He'd been knocked out cold on the pitch. And he was like, the last thing he remembered was being in France. So all that kind of interim period had kind of, and I'm not a neurologist, so I'm not a scientist here, but at the individual level, that's pretty scary, right? To have a whole, the memory did come back.
Yes. But
that's a scary thing, right? And the Steve Thompson case is a tragedy because he's really, really struggling. Again, I'm not saying anything's not in the public domain. So back to the point, it will be people who are kind of coming more towards the end of their careers, because they don't want to make, again,
And do you know whether any of these people have used psychedelics? Yeah,
Rory has openly talked about his experiences. So again, I'm not betraying any confidences here. So Rory, at the end of his career, had multiple head injuries, multiple concussions, multiple surgeries, and was in really bad shape. And attributes his kind of road to recovery to the use of psychedelics and theogens. I don't like that. Psychedelics is almost such a kind of loaded term now. It's almost like I want to retire it. Kind of using a kind of a media lens. It's like there's so much stigma attached to that.
My preference is plant medicine, but this means we're not talking about LSD or MDMA. So here on the show, I usually refer to it as plant medicine, unless we're talking about a wider range of medicine.
I actually was part of the leadership group of the kind of grassroots movement, Thank You Plant Medicine, a few years ago. It was a kind of an online thing, and it was kind of pandemic affected. But there was an international back to international networks. There was an international network of people who were advocating for plant medicine, Thank You Plant Medicine, and we used to get criticised for saying, well, it's fungi is not plant medicine. It's not plant. You'd be like, right, where do you kind of go with that? It's like, all right, sorry, So, but yeah, we're talking about kind of the broad spectrum of things, but psychedelics is such a loaded term, and the stigma that's been created over, I don't know how many years. The minute you say psychedelics to someone, they're like, it's hippies in the field. It's people kind of losing their minds. It's kind of all that. The previous iteration of this, maybe in the 60s, maybe did go a little bit off-piste, and that's why we're kind of, we're not saying that, we think people should do psychedelics recreationally. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about there's this promise that is being shown in these compounds, which we should be looking at. And bringing it back to the athletes thing, it's like athletes are, sports in general is like a massively important part of our lives. You know, like whether you hate sports or love sports, you know, millions of people around the world are participating in it. You know, they're kind of iconic figures, iconic moments. You know, sports is a big deal. Athletes are a big deal. People make millions out of athletes. The athletes make millions, but the sponsors make millions. The media owners make millions. The agencies make millions. The sponsorship, image rights people make millions. It's a big deal.
But somehow, suddenly, the moment they retire, everybody drops them.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sad reality of it. It's like, you know, it's a bit like kind of an actor or something. You know, one minute you're kind of, you know, headlining, next minute you're kind of no one really cares. And you know, obviously that has a kind of a psychological kind of effect. But I mean, there's so many kind of, I guess, issues that face athletes, right? Not, you know, the kind of the you know, the physical stuff, but there's also like you know, take something like swimming or gymnastics you know, and I have daughters, right? My daughter plays rugby, so I'm kind of, and she used to be a swimmer, so I've kind of been in and around that sort of arena, and the pressure that, you know, in terms of kind of, you know, body image and body shape, you know, like that goes on kind of young girls and boys, you know, and unfortunately, you know, things like swimming and gymnastics, there's been like a ton of scandal. Again, in the public domain, you know, like, you know, around the way that coaches behave, and, you know, it's not, some of it's not been the best. I mean, that's be putting it mildly. There's been some pretty horrific things happening. So you've got, you know, you've got the kind of the body image issue, you've got the overtraining, you've got the pressure of performance, you've got the parental pressure, sometimes parental expectations, and then you've got the coaches, and then you've got, you know, and then that's just pressure upon pressure upon pressure. Add in some of the kind of abuse stuff, and you've got a whole cohort of like young people who are kind of effectively kind of been in a traumatic situation. You know, so there's kind of, you know, so there's the kind of trauma that trauma needs to kind of be resolved.
And that's why I asked that question about whether there's any research being done about using psychedelics during the life of an athlete as an athlete before retirement, because of all the pressure that they are experiencing. I don't know, maybe microdosing, because we know that some of them have to use anti-anxiety medication and all the chemical medication, and whether microdosing would be a better option than taking anti-anxiety medication for athletes.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a brave athlete, probably a well-established one, to be open about this, because we're still talking about Schedule 1 substances, Schedule 1 in the States, Schedule 1 in the UK, and then you know, their employers, you know, so the big franchises, the football clubs, or whatever, you know, the people that run their media and stuff. I mean, brands and agencies and broadcasters and everyone are terrified of this because of the Schedule 1 nature of it, you know, and you know, so there's not that much opportunity for someone to kind of, you know, explore this in their careers kind of officially. So take someone like, you know, a high-profile athlete who's come out, like having used something like ayahuasca, like Aaron Rodgers, you know, one of the best quarterbacks of his generation. He, you know, well established in his career, has already won a Super Bowl. I think that's right. Yeah, you know, he can be honest and say, look, I've used ayahuasca. Where someone may be coming through early on in their career probably isn't in a position to do that. And that's what we're kind of trying to get to, a point where we can change that. You know, Deontay Wilder, the boxer, you know, has come out and said he's used ayahuasca. He announced it in a post-fight interview in Saudi Arabia, of all places, where he didn't, you know.
Oh wow, that's brave.
Yeah, that's kind of, you know, but he'd already won the world title, you know, like, you know, so he was kind of well established in his career. So, you know, Mike Tyson had come out and you know, spoken about his use of psychedelics.
But during or after retirement?
Yeah, and that,
because we have Joe Rogan, of course, who's
yeah, Joe Rogan kind
big
of
advocate.
Yeah, nothing to lose. I mean, we have, you know, because Ian McCall, you know, a co-founder in the States, is an ex-UFC fighter. I mean, obviously we have access to, you know, to kind of people who work in the UFC. But I guess the issue we have is that, you know, because it's Schedule 1, it's very, very difficult to talk about it openly and to be kind of open about using it, because, I mean, I mean, obviously the States has had its recent sort of setback for the movement, if you like, with the FDA ruling on MDMA and all the kind of the stuff that's come out about that recently. So I mean, and then there's been a couple of votes against, so there's been a bit of a pushback. If maybe there was quite a lot of sort of psychedelic evangelism a few years ago, and everyone kind of, there was lots of money sloshing around, and there was money going into kind of early stage companies, and everyone was quite excited about it. But there's been a bit of pushback, and there's been a few setbacks. So, if you're kind of on the fence at the moment, there's probably a sense of, well, which way is it going to go? Is it going to fizzle out? Is it going to remain a very kind of marginal kind of activity, and people will just do it as they're called to do it, on the underground, or go to Peru, go to legal environments in Netherlands or whatever, and just we'll keep it at that? Or do we kind of believe that there's more to this, more potential? And I don't know if you're aware of Roy Amara and Amara's curve, right? So when there's a new technology, people get very excited about it, and there's this whole kind of big kind of splash, and everyone is, really excited. And then there's a bit of like, there's a bit of a kind of drop off, and people kind of then go, well, actually, it hasn't changed the world in the way we might have thought. It's kind of, we're deluded. And there's a kind of big drop off, and I think it's called the trough of disillusionment. This is curve. It's quite an interesting curve. Look at it. And I guess the premise is that we overestimate the short term implications of a new technology, and we underestimate the long term. And I think what maybe in psychedelics, I mean, it's an organic technology, right? It's just, for argument's sake, let's just call it a technology, a new technology that's come into the kind of public domain, even though it's not. But just assume it is. But there was a big kind of big surge of interest in it, and then that kind of dropped off, and now it's kind of starting to kind of pick up again, where people are going, actually, well, there is, the evidence base isn't there because there's not enough yet, but there's enough there to think actually we can actually do something pretty good with this technology. And obviously you got the people at Imperial doing amazing work. There's kind of research going on all around the world. It's kind of sitting in academia at the moment. And I guess this is what I'm trying to do, which is say a lot of this stuff is happening kind of discreetly in academia and in the kind of small community of the converted, but outside of our kind of small community of the converted is public awareness is actually pretty low about in this field. I mean, I looked at some sort of Google search terms as an indicator, as a kind of to give myself some sort of sense about what was happening in was the stuff that we were seeing all the time, was it cutting through into kind of mainstream kind of dialogues, and it just isn't. There's nobody really searching for psychedelics and head injury. Nobody's really searching for kind of psychedelics and eating disorders. It's just not there. And the people that I speak to in my line of work in the media and ad agency world, quite a few senior level people are absolutely don't know anything about it. It's like a flat line in terms of awareness. So looking at it from a kind of purely media perspective and marketing perspective, but at the top of the funnel, which is awareness, we're very much there. We're not kind of down in the lower funnel. What's it? Awareness, interest, EDICA, decision, action, or whatever it is. So we're kind of at the top of the funnel in terms of our kind of media job that we have to do. And athletes is a pretty good way of doing that because they've got such a high profile. The veterans angle is kind of achieving more cut through in the States, maybe. I mean, obviously, Heroic Hearts operates in the States, operates here, Australia, and there's an offshoot in Canada as well. And veterans was kind of at one point seen as a really good kind of advocacy group for this, and it kind of hasn't quite had the kind of cut through here.
So that's my question. Why do you think that the veterans have been more successful when it comes to using psychedelics for their mental health issues than a group like athletes?
I think, just the lived reality of a veteran in the last sort of 15, 20 years has been, there's been multiple conflict zones, So, people have been through theatres of war maybe a couple of times. Keith Abraham, a friend who set up Heroic Hearts here, was an ex-paratrooper. He'd done, 2 summer tours of Helmand Province, leading a kind of parachute regiment, and all of that, all of the things that entails. So those are kind of real lived experiences, kind of unimpeachable, if you like. It's not just that, a Premier League footballer had too much money and gambled it away. Mm-hmm.
They don't see that maybe the society doesn't see it as a problem yet.
Exactly. So that probably, there's probably more sympathy for a veteran who's had, those real life experiences versus a Premier League footballer who's gambled all his money away. People say, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that." Whereas the reality of that for the footballer is tragic for him, tragic for his family.
And addiction is a condition that has to be treated.
Yeah, for sure. And there's been quite a lot of high profile cases that have made the news. So you've got Stephen Corker, who talks openly about his gambling addictions. Dele Alli was in the papers for his substance abuse, like they're talking about kind of painkillers and sleeping pills. There's been multiple stories of athletes with alcohol problems. So there's, these are all kind of in the public domain. But there's maybe this kind of assumption that, all right, well, they've got money, athletes are all rich, they can sort their problems out with money. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's what it is. But that's what we're working to change, And I guess it's one thing raising awareness, like for the kind of, for mental health struggles in athletes. And that kind of work has been done quite well by people like Tyson Fury, Ricky Hatton, the people I've just spoken about who talk openly about their struggles. The more I kind of get into this, the more I interact with kind of player welfare, the player welfare industry and ex-players who are now working in that industry to try and help people coming through, people who've experienced anxiety and depression and addictions and so on, who are trying to help people coming through. But that awareness then has to try and, for me anyway, we feel like, right, we know there's a problem, but what do we do about it? And obviously there's psychedelics, I believe, can have a really important role, in this, and obviously the more awareness there is, the more public opinion then maybe shifts away from this stigma that psychedelics are somehow this kind of flaky thing that involves people losing their minds. The more we can kind of shift public opinion that more that these are kind of viable opportunities, then we have a much better chance of politics and policy following, because politics and policy follows public opinion and not the other way around. When I studied politics, the rule of thumb was that policy follows public opinion by 30 years. But that was in a previous media environment. Like with modern media, that time frame will be kind of much more compressed. So maybe politics will follow public opinion by 3 years. I don't know, just making it up. But I think that's what Marshall McLuhan used to talk about, kind of the electric speed of modern media will kind of change the whole way we interact. So it could be, quicker than that. It could be that, there's a breakthrough case with an athlete or a situation which then somehow gets into the kind of public and policy sphere, and we get psilocybin rescheduled, because that's what we're working to do. Here is another kind of area that I'm working in, which is on psilocybin access rights. We're trying to get psilocybin changed from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, which is not the same as classification. It's important to realise the difference, right? So psilocybin can be Class A on the street, but Schedule 2, the same way that heroin is Class A on the street, but morphine is Schedule 2. But at the moment, psilocybin is Schedule 1, which means it's kind of deemed to have no medical benefit. Which we, if we look at the kind of the emerging evidence that says that that's not where it should be sitting. And as soon as it, psilocybin, for example, goes from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, then we'll see kind of, the opportunities for research and more data will become available, because at the moment, we have a cohort of athletes going to Oregon in April, because Oregon psilocybin is legal in Oregon, whereas it's not legal here. So in order to get a clinical trial together will take multiple years and several million pounds. But we're doing that as well. But at the same time, there are people suffering from concussion injuries today, and if there's an opportunity to help, support them in their kind of path to kind of healing, then that's what we're going to do. So at the moment, Oregon is the place where we have to go. But that, that's obviously not practical.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be Oregon.
It shouldn't have
yes.
to go all the way to Oregon in order to do that. We've got an example of an athlete who's in Australia, who we obviously subject to the proper screening and appropriateness for the treatment. He's not in a physical shape to be able to fly from Australia to Oregon. To have to do this. Obviously Australia's got slightly different regulations, but our networks are kind of in Oregon. A guy called Daniel Carcillo, who played ice hockey. A very interesting case, actually. So Daniel Carcillo was an ice hockey player, played it for Chicago Blackhawks, won the Stanley Cup, which is the kind of equivalent of the Super Bowl, and had a lot of head injuries and head trauma in his career. And I think when he finished his career, he was kind of diagnosed with potentially kind of early onset dementia, similar to the rugby player that we spoke about, who can't remember playing for England in the World Cup final. So Daniel had a sort of diagnosis of, right, you might have early onset dementia, and he was young, in his 30s.
Wow.
And so spent a lot, again, this is all public domain, so you can look it up. But Daniel's is in our network, and he investigated all the kind of existing treatment options that were available, and none of them seemed to be working. And then he had an experience with psilocybin, and found that he, didn't have the symptoms anymore, and went back and got tested, and they were like, well, you're better. And so that inspired him to create a facility where other people in the same situation as he was can experience the same potential for treatment. And we're always very, very careful to say this is not the ultimate cure. It's not just like take some mushrooms and you're going to be fine in your life. Yeah. It's not about saying that. It's about saying that the compound in psilocybin as a compound has the potential to help you on the path to your recovery, potentially, subject to all the kind of caveats of appropriateness, dose, setting, all the stuff that we kind of talk about in the kind of psychedelic industry.
You mentioned that you work with psilocybin access rights. What has been the government's response to the work that you've been doing around athletes?
It's very slow progress. There's an MP on the Labour side, Charlotte Nichols, who has talked about this openly in Parliament. And there was a question that Prime Minister's questions that Rishi Sunak answered a question on psilocybin. So it's kind of there. It's kind of in some sort of somebody's in tray, but obviously we've had the change of government. It's sitting in the Home Office at the moment, as I understand it. So if you think what the Home Office was engaged in before the election, the Home Office was talking about Rwanda, talking about boats sailing across the Channel. Psilocybin access was not high on the priority list for that previous.
Which is ridiculous on its own. So.
Yeah, that's a whole other world. But with respect to the previous two Home Secretaries, they didn't seem to be kind of pioneering.
Yeah, the nation's mental health is not a priority for them.
It was not. And then obviously the new Labour governments come in and, like anyone, you can talk a good game, but when it comes to it, I mean, it'll take a brave, reforming kind of politician or group of politicians to do this. And right now, we don't seem to have them. I mean, with the greatest respect, I know it's not an easy job, but it's going to take someone a bit like, back in the day where, I think it was Roy Jenkins, who was a previous, one of the most kind of biggest reformers as a Home Secretary. It's going to take someone like that. It's going to take a real political heavyweight to come in and go, right, look, let's have a grown-up conversation about this, right? The Misuse of Drugs Act was, 1971 was the last time we looked at this. There's been quite a lot of changes in the interim period. There are a lot of people who are kind of interacting with these compounds in a safe and responsible way, not losing their minds, having better lives as a result of it, potentially, healing some kind of fundamental health issues that that previously weren't being addressed through the existing pathways. Now, again, I'm not here to say that SSRI antidepressant medication is a bad thing. For some people, antidepressant SSRI medication is an absolute lifesaver. Fine, right? I'm not saying people shouldn't be using SSRIs. I'm not positioning it as an either or, right? For some people, SSRIs, antidepressant medications are problematic, cause withdrawal symptoms, cause dependency, I know people who will say that they've been really difficult for them. So SSRIs are not for them. Psilocybin is for them, potentially. Right, so for some people, psilocybin is problematic and they shouldn't do it. For some people, it's life-changing. SSRIs are life-changing for some people and potentially problematic for others. One is Schedule 1 and the other one is prescribed very freely on
mass.
On the National Health. And so there's a kind of a huge disconnect there. Again, we're not advocating for a free-for-all here. It's like, I don't want my children to go out and be able to access psilocybin on the street and go and do it, free, in large quantities with their friends, because that's not a responsible way to look at it. In the right conditions. And again, this is another huge area. Is like, what are those right conditions going to be? Is it going to be, in a medical facility? Is it going to be in a more kind of, kind of wellness kind of retreat facility? Is it at home? Probably not. But I mean, that's to be discussed, because that's our challenge as people who want to create an industry. Is that how are we going to deliver this? How are we going to make it safe?
Yeah, but luckily more and more people are talking about it more openly, like Alistair Campbell on The Rest is Politics. He talks about his mental health history, and he also mentions psychedelics. So my hope is that the more people talk about it and they bring awareness, as you mentioned, and that will slowly change policy. So if an athlete is listening to this podcast and they suffer from various past head injuries or depression as a result of losing the limelight or losing their income, how can they contact you and how can you help them?
Oh, that's a big one. So I mean, Athletes Journey Home is a registered not-for-profit in the UK and in the States. So we have a kind of functioning kind of organisation and structure. We have a network of retreat centres in Peru and then the United States and Colombia, and through the Heroic Hearts Network, probably Holland as well. So we have a network of established, tried and tested, reputable retreat centres that we partner with. We have we have the equipment, we have the research partners. So we have that kind of framework of place and of process that people can avail themselves of. So it'd be a simple case of getting in touch with us. Athletes Journey Home. I guess we can.
Yes, I'll put the link in the show.
Put all the links in, and then it's a case of saying, well, what is the challenge that they're facing, and then each centre has its own sort of protocol in terms of screening. So it would be a case of going through the screening process, and then obviously chatting about what potentially can happen in these experiences.
And how is it different from normal retreats? So let's say an athlete decides that they want to try psilocybin. Are the retreats that you work with different from any other retreat in terms of the investigation into various head injuries, etc.?
Yeah, they're different insofar as that they don't. You go on a standard retreat, you don't get any kind of neuroimaging or microbiome analyses done. So there's a kind of a research component which is not there in normal retreats. And then it's a case of saying, well, do you want that data to kind of do you I guess agree to for us to be using you, I guess, as a source of kind of collecting data. And then the difference also is that as part of the overall, I guess, treatment package, if you like, we have a psychotherapy partner who offers up to a year, as long as you like, really, of psychotherapies and a kind of an underpinning. Because one of the challenges that kind of people have with using sort of psychedelics in a retreat setting is that they can go to, say, Peru, have an experience for 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever, longer. But then you're kind of, outside of maybe a couple of follow-up calls, you're kind of more or less left to your own devices. And I guess that's a criticism which not criticism, but it's a comment on, the reality of it is that, the retreat centres in Peru don't have the bandwidth capability to support people when they get back beyond a couple of maybe follow-up calls. And I guess I'm doing a disservice to some of these, some of the integration packages are probably more kind of robust than that now. But what we're saying is that there needs to be a kind of a wraparound sort of care for this. So we offer, we partner with a psychotherapy partner, and up to a year's worth of psychotherapy is part of it. There are also other, I guess, kind of complementary kind of techniques and processes to follow in terms of having good protocols in terms of diet, having good protocols in terms of having for example a meditation practice or a breathing practice or an exercise practice. So it's to kind of find out what works for the athlete to say how do you kind of sustain the benefit, if you like, because it's one thing just doing the experience, the treatment, whatever, but then there needs to be more to it than that for it to be sustainable. Because what can happen is that people can come back and then they're just in the same environments, and then the same I guess temptations arise, and then they're back to kind of where they started. And so for it to be sustainable, it has to be part of a kind of bigger kind of approach to life, I guess. And I guess that's what happens with ayahuasca, right? I mean, the preparation for an ayahuasca diet is, you have to clean out your diet, you have to prepare, then you have to kind of, do the dieta, which again is quite, restrictive in terms of diet and kind of, mental approach. It's not just drinking ayahuasca, and that, I mean, there's a temptation then to say, oh, well, let's just do psychedelics and we'll be fine. Again, back to that point that it's not just kind of one and done. It can be. I mean, some people can have a completely life-changing experience and, never pick up a drink again, or never pick up a betting slip again, or never go online again, or whatever it is they're doing, or they can have a, completely new direction. It can happen that way, but generally speaking, you probably need to do a bit more work, as they say, the work needs
Amazing. So I will leave a link to your website where athletes can reach out to you via the website. And thank you so much, Joe Vaughan. Thank you so much for joining me on Obsicast.
It's great to be here.
Take care.